All right. Hey, everybody, what's going on? Coach William Grazione here. Thank you guys so much for checking out this episode of Education Evolution with myself and my special guest I have for you today, Sam Miller. He is Sam Miller Science on Instagram. You guys make sure you check him out. So today's episode, we're going to be digging deep into hormonal manipulations and things such as this to make sure that you guys can actually be able to apply this information directly to your clients. We've gotten tons and tons of questions revolving around things like hormones, PCOS, Hashimotos, and all of these specific situations. And I thought, who better to bring on than the guy that I know who specializes in hormones, Sam Miller. So let's just go ahead and I guess get started on how Sam and I were introduced. A mutual friend of both of ours, Susan Landers, actually told me when I was at Amanda Bucci's mastermind, she's like, hey, you need to reach out to Sam. And Sam and I had the opportunity to meet up at one of our mentors' mastermind out in Scottsdale, Arizona, by the name of Jason Phillips. And I think we hung out probably like the entire weekend, hit it off, and I figured Sam was the perfect person to bring in to talk to you guys about these topics. So without further ado, Sam, if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Will. No, I think that was pretty good. I mean, I always enjoyed, I think our first weekend, we probably got like 2 workouts in together. We had a couple meals. I mean, we spent a lot of time together that first weekend. It was like when you go from 0 to 60 pretty quickly. So, I definitely kind of, always had an appreciation for Will and what he does with metabolic evolution. And then even, back just in terms of competing and everything. So in terms of my story, I kind of developed an interest in hormones, both due to certain client problems that I was facing or running into, and then also a little bit of my own personal fitness journey. So over time, just realized that more and more, there was more to the story than just calories and sets and reps in the gym. And even if you were really great at exercise programming, and even if you were great at calculating macros, you really needed to understand how nutrition and lifestyle and recovery really serve as like a toggle for our internal physiology. And that's just like a fancy way of saying like our internal health, our hormonal health, our neurotransmitters, our gut health, all of those things. And what I started to realize is just the bigger picture is they're really all integrated. And so nutrition, training, and lifestyle are one of the best ways to be healthy in those areas, to feel your best. And really when something's wrong in those areas, it's typically something where we see our clients or just individuals in their own fitness transformation begin to have trouble hitting their physical goals. So it's very hard to make physical changes, positive improvements, and adaptations when there's something wrong with our physiology on the inside. So anything we can do to sort of protect ourselves or optimize things, and usually it comes through the form of our habits or certain implementations within our training and nutrition, can really help to move us towards our goals over the long haul. So as I saw that popping up again and again and again, I just started to really immerse myself in those topics. And that's kind of what has, brought Will and I close together. And, what I do largely as a professional in the fitness industry today is largely working with and teaching those topics to other coaches and to my clients.
I love that, man. I love that. So it's interesting because it oftentimes is curiosity. For people like us, it's like, all right, maybe this isn't working out 100% the way that I had envisioned it to. So you and we're both very curious people. We don't necessarily view something for just what it is or accept information for what the information is, but rather we actually want to dig a little bit and we want to find out the intricacies of how specific things work. So if I heard you correctly, basically your curiosity is what kind of got you into really diving into hormone health, right?
Yeah, it's definitely curiosity. And I don't even think initially when I started, I knew that I was really learning solely about hormone health. Like I just thought it was like the next layer of, science-based nutrition or training, and that understanding that would ultimately help me be better at training and nutrition. It wasn't until maybe a couple years ago that I started to realize like, oh, okay, this is kind of a genre in its own right. And some people have sort of made careers like literally just writing about those topics and everything. But I really wanted to help integrate it from a lifestyle approach, because I think, we'll see certain folks on the internet who popularize information and oftentimes they sort of use hormones as this like scapegoat for problems that people may have, or it's a hormonal solution to weight loss. Well, weight loss, really, we still need to consider a calorie deficit, but we also need to consider, well, what is your body's metabolic rate based off of its internal function and things like that. So I think initially I didn't even realize fully that curiosity was centered in hormones. It just sort of, it really connected well. But yeah, there's certainly a little curiosity there, some interest, and then just the practice of it and the application of it, it just kept coming up more and more and more and more. I think it's an issue that's become more prevalent in our society and within the clients that a lot of coaches will be coaching over the next decade and beyond. So just really became something I was passionate about, curious about. And then it was kind of like a proximity bias thing, right? It's like you see something once, and then once you've seen it, you start to look out for it. It's like if you've never seen a certain car, and then all of a sudden you see that car, you start to see that car everywhere, and you're just kind of primed with it. So that definitely, did start to happen for me a little bit. But I'm glad it did, because it definitely, changed my career and certainly how I'm able to help people.
Absolutely. Yeah. So something I want to bring up, because I know you've been involved in the game a long time, even though it seems like just recently you've kind of gotten your name out there and you became more known. But if you would kind of talk to our listeners a little bit about kind of how you got started and how you transitioned up to owning Oracle Nutrition and Training now, kind of where you started, and give a little briefing on your story of how you basically went from working in, graduating from college, obviously working in corporate America, and then kind of climbing that ladder into entrepreneurship.
Sure. So I actually got my first training certification when I was about 18. That was primarily personal training focused. I had always worked like at campus recreation at the university, and always had a little bit of a fitness or nutrition related side hustle. Even when I had my corporate job, I was coaching clients online and had some work in my home state. But I was largely local for a very long time. And so thinking about that certification, I mean, for me, that was over 10 years ago now. So it really has been quite some time. My interest in nutrition came like kind of after I started in training and personal training, and realizing that there was more to the story than just what people were doing in the gym. And so nutrition was really kind of my gateway to begin to learn more. A lot of folks in our area were solely on the gym side or strength and conditioning side or personal training side or even bodybuilding side in terms of training for hypertrophy. And so I saw it as my way to sort of differentiate myself. And so over the last couple of years, I've really sort of moved into that nutrition and hormones and optimization area. I still certainly have an interest in training and fitness, and we still do program that for our clients. But for me, I think the biggest change was just beginning to share that knowledge on both social media and at a national level, and making sure to go to events and network with folks and attend seminars and conferences and things like that. And then once I began to sort of share my message, I realized folks were interested in it. And then I started getting asked to do different events or podcasts. And really, I think what's probably helped my career the most is a mix of podcasts and like public speaking or seminars. And that's just something that I really enjoy, because I like to teach and I like to answer questions and work through problems with people. So that sort of brought me to where I am today, both personally, myself, Sam Miller, as a coach, but also for my company, Oracle Training and Nutrition, and what we're able to do and how we help people.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that story, man. Like, something I tell all of our coaches here is that if you're going to do it right, it's probably going to take a long time. And there's a couple key takeaways there that I really want to highlight you for, because I think that oftentimes in today's coaching space, everybody's trying to they're trying to make it to the top as fast as humanly possible. And I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with that. However, what you have to understand is that in order to become a respected coach in the field, or in order to become somebody who people view to be somebody who's very knowledgeable, it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of self-education. So something that everybody who's listening to this can learn from is, notice how Sam said, like, he's been involved in the industry for a long time. He's attended tons of seminars. He's hired coaches. He's always been around individuals within the space, people that he can network with, and ultimately people that he can build really good relationships with, and always just puts himself in the position to be a student. And those of you who are in here in the Fitness Online Coaching Academy, if you're not currently investing in your own education at least a couple of times a year, in my opinion, guys, I think you're probably doing it wrong, and you should really start to take whatever you're earning from your business, reinvest it back into your own education so that you guys can ultimately always continue to grow and expand, ultimately leading you guys to be able to work with a vast array of clientele. Would you agree, Sam?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I had coaches myself for my own competitive pursuits, whether that was for men's physique or anything else. I had several different coaches in the industry who were served as mentors to me. I probably had at least 3 or 4 or 5 of those. I was always reading, getting additional certifications, going to seminars. And for me, I mean, I was coached by a coach for like the probably first 8 years or so of my time as a personal trainer and nutrition coach. So for me, I had just gotten used to that. And then it wasn't until later on that I sort of, started to pursue different interests and get different types of coaching. But for me, that's really how you get a different look at how you might approach things. And also being coached through your own trials and tribulations does help you to be a more empathetic coach, where you can be a resource and really a source of consistency for your clients. So I always really had a lot of value in that, and have believed in coaching for a very long time. And certainly it is kind of an interesting story in the sense that you do see a lot of like popular influencer people who are maybe 23, 24, 25 years old. I'm 30 now. So for me, that time of my life was largely spent, getting educated and doing things locally. Like I was the local expert, or I was the guy that you would go to if you had a problem. And my business was okay doing that. I certainly didn't have like tons of problems or anything. I didn't have like quite the reach or influence, I guess you could say. So certainly started with just having that impact with people who needed help, and then do a good job with them. And then they'll like refer a friend, or you'll share their story or their results. And then people typically resonate with that because they kind of see themselves in that case study. So that's kind of how I got started. And certainly I think Will and I both share a lot of similar values in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you pretty much nailed my startup there as well. It's like you're becoming the local figure that people go to, and you're beginning to answer their questions. You're solving their problems. You're essentially becoming the problem solver. When you become the problem solver for a variety of people that are in your facility, people start to recognize you for being that person that has the authority, right? Then it's about going out into the world and massively impacting those around you, because you have invested that time in your education. You take your early 20s, you invested in your education, you invested in yourself, so that when you get into your 30s, into your 35, 40 range, you can really be hitting the ground running, making sure that you're growing a company that will essentially take care of you after the 35, 40 years old. So one of the biggest questions that we're kind of going to transition this into actually talking about circadian rhythms. So one of the biggest questions that we get here within the Fitness Online Coaching Academy has so much to do about lifestyle stress, increases in cortisol, specifically cortisol in general. It's like, how does stress actually adjust our body's ability to either A, build muscle, or B, lose fat? So if we want, let's go ahead and dig into a little bit about circadian rhythms, starting out our conversation.
Sure. So with a healthy circadian rhythm, typically, your initial bout or burst of energy comes in the morning from like a cortisol awakening response, which is really a large component or large portion of the cortisol that you produce for a day. And really the job there is to begin to create energy for the body, start breaking things down, and get you into motion, which is a healthy, normal adrenal response. If you had no cortisol in the morning and you were flatlined, you would really lack energy. You would feel lethargic, very foggy. It would take you a long time to get going. Then, later in the day, we basically have a hormone that's sort of inverse to cortisol that's released from the pineal gland in our body. That's melatonin. A lot of us have heard of that. We see the supplements at the store. Melatonin is not a primary hormone, but a secondary hormone in the body is how a lot of clinicians or medical professionals might classify it. Melatonin basically is sort of this shot or signal that fires to help you go to sleep. there are some common misconceptions about like that relationship, but ideally you have this nice cortisol curve where it rises in the morning and then begins to sort of fall at night. If cortisol remains elevated, you typically are wired and tired in the sense that you would have a hard time falling asleep. It would impact melatonin production. Melatonin production can also be impacted by things like blue light. So that's why your optic nerves and your eyes are very sensitive to different forms of light, which makes sense because, hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, before electricity and computers and iPhones, we would wander around outside. When it would begin to get dark, our body would know that it's time to go to sleep. And so we send a lot of little artificial signals to our body that sort of confuse it in the sense of when it's supposed to sleep and when it's supposed to wake up. And ultimately, all of those things sort of influence circadian rhythms. Things like our eating patterns, getting sunlight exposure, light on our skin can certainly impact that. I think I read something where thyroid receptors and vitamin D receptors are actually like the most prominent receptors in the body. So being mindful that light does influence your overall health. Vitamin D is very much a hormone in its own right and its own characteristics. So all of these things do play a large role in circadian rhythm and having that daily balance, where ideally we have a little bit of a mild stress response in the morning, and then that sort of declines throughout the day, ultimately allowing us to get quality sleep at night, to recover from what we're doing in the gym, and ultimately reset things like insulin sensitivity and help with hormone production as well.
Mm-hmm. So isn't it shown that like currently right now that between 5 and 6 hours of sleep per night is actually used in a lot of the sleep deprivation studies, right?
So a lot of the sleep deprivation, I think it varies depending on a couple of things, country, the like ethical portion of the study too, because like there's a certain, getting people to like volunteer for sleep deprivation is a little bit tricky. So I'll look at some studies like that. I also tend to look at studies of like night shift workers or people who tend to miss their natural circadian rhythm, but it's by choice. So they're basically electing to participate in like a retrospective study because their life kind of, let's say you're a nurse and you work a night shift or a firefighter or something, you're already doing that by choice because it's your profession or your career. So then to participate in a study, it's ethical because they're not making you like change your life or do anything crazy. I think I've seen some sleep deprivation studies around that amount. I think sometimes retrospectively there may be less. I think sometimes the control groups are a little bit different. But 5 or 6 would definitely put us in a place where we're lacking adequate amount of time to move through things like REM sleep, deep sleep, and light sleep, producing the hormones we need. It's been shown that that level of sleep deprivation that Will is talking about can be up to a 20% difference in testosterone production in men, and also compromise insulin sensitivity in both men and women. So certainly 5 or 6 would not be ideal, but I think it does kind of vary depending on who's conducting the study and what are the like ethical ramifications kind of behind it and things like that. But there's certainly some decent sleep studies out there.
Yeah, so that's actually exactly where I wanted kind of to take the conversation. So when you saw me at the Arnold, dude, I was completely sleep deprived.
Yeah.
It was like 18 days in a row. I think I had only gotten like 4 hours of sleep. So I wanted to take it into that route because a lot of people have clients that essentially are working the overnight shift, right? Now, let's say, for instance, we have clients who are working from 10 p.m. to 4 o'clock in the morning. And obviously in a perfect world, we would essentially rise as the sun rises and we would set as the sun sets. We'd have this perfect circadian rhythm. Our body would work on a beautiful time clock and all of that would be magical and everybody would respond perfectly. However, in a context-dependent situation, and we're working with clients who do work an overnight shift, what are some of the negative effects that you've actually seen happen hormonally due to people who are essentially working throughout the night and aren't operating on a regular 24-hour shift?
Sure. So I think it depends on a couple things. One, is that a shift that you work all the time and that's your regular shift? Or is this a temporary thing, like 1 or 2 nights a week you work nights, or you're filling in for someone and then you work days? I think it's actually harder to ping pong back and forth between days and nights than it is to just work nights or just work days. I know Dr. Serrano is a big fan of having night shift workers, if they are consistently on night shift, like take vitamin D in the evening and then take melatonin in the morning when they're getting off to like kind of help reset. some of what's going on. He seems to have a lot of knowledge in that area. But I do notice kind of a flip-flop or swap in that cortisol curve. Our light exposure is a little weird. So the biggest thing is like you probably want like the light blocking shades and curtains and blackout, like eliminate light, use an eye mask, things like that to really get as much sleep as you can during the day so that your body does have an understanding of kind of when it's supposed to be awake and when it's asleep. And then you're generally going to have to rely on some other form of lighting besides just the lighting in your home. So making sure you are getting some sun exposure, or things like the Juve or like happy lights and things like that might be beneficial for someone with a circadian rhythm that's influenced by their work. But we definitely do see some changes in hormonal health. I think lower tolerance to high exercise volumes would probably be one, and certainly can influence insulin sensitivity in terms of overall tolerance of total calories and also fats and carbohydrates.
Yeah. So with regards to, first and foremost, I guess let's go ahead and talk about the exercise portion. Is that essentially just because you're not getting into that deep sleep to be able to actually recover from the training volume that you're accruing throughout the day?
And just the cortisol curve in general. So like if you have a greater sympathetic response, so basically your body's central nervous system has a sympathetic response, which sympathetic would mean like a cortisol release or alertness that's required. And a parasympathetic is going to be things that are restorative or calming, and really put you into a place of recovery. And what tends to happen with those night shift workers is just it further sort of tilts the scales towards the sympathetic, whether that's from sleep loss, whether that's from stress, and anything that's causing us to stack up additional items in that category of the sympathetic is reducing our ability to recover. Ultimately can even begin to influence things like HRV, which is our heart rate variability. We see decreases in recovery, and then, subsequently hormonal changes, the volume tolerance, which I think is both a hormonal adaptation, but also a central nervous system adaptation as well in terms of overall recovery, feeling our best, neurotransmitter balance, and things like that.
Now, in regards to on the nutrition side, you would actually mention that lack of sleep throughout the evening could actually lead to some type of insulin resistance. Is that correct?
Correct. So some of the best ways to like improve insulin sensitivity are sleep, stress reduction, and just daily movement. And that could even be walking. Now obviously there are some great, there's some great information and research out there about training and how that influences insulin sensitivity. I know our friend Chris actually is super passionate about that area of the science. And there's no doubt that resistance training will improve your insulin sensitivity, as does really most forms of movement. But we have to consider, okay, but this needs to be balanced with our stress response. Ultimately, if we are highly stressed and cortisol is consistently elevated, if that begins to break down energy substrates in the body, we are sort of going to have this elevated glucose phenomenon in a way. So sleeping can help in the sense that we're managing cortisol, and we sort of want to keep everything in balance. So it certainly does. I think also when you think about it, it's this sort of cycle that perpetuates itself. If we sleep well and we have a really great training session and we become more sensitive to insulin, and then we sort of recover from that training session and we eat the proper amount of food, now we're better prepared and primed for our training session the next day. And then, maybe because of the carbohydrate content, we sleep better. And then when we sleep better, we set more PRs the next day. And it just sort of like, there's this domino effect of, we can't really look in a vacuum of like, well, just insulin or just cortisol or just sleep or just training. You'll slowly begin to see how really all of these begin to interconnect. And I think that's something that gets missed oftentimes, is that, okay, here's how I see that, sleep is helping me get better results in the gym. I have less cravings. My blood sugar is more stable. So I'm making better food choices. When I make those good food choices, that further improves my blood glucose. And then when I'm making those good choices, my recovery is improved. So then I have great training sessions, and then I sleep. So they really all kind of compound to work really well together. But if we look at that on the opposite side, when one or two things go wrong, it can start now like everything feels like it's going wrong. So you got to like stop the negative momentum or inertia and kind of move things back the other way.
Right. Absolutely. So a lot of you guys within the Fitness Online Coaching Academy, you guys have always asked me like about things like sleep. things like, hey, clients are having really wonky weigh-ins, what's going on? And typically it's always going to correlate somehow to either making sure they're getting enough sleep, making sure they're resting and recovering properly, because so many people will complain about their weight and maybe they're not seeing the weight loss that they ideally want. And the things that Sam and I just talked about in regards to, the insulin irregularities, if you're not sleeping very well at night. And then the other thing being that increase in cortisol from not sleeping, both of those are basically like creating this environment for your clients to not essentially be able to be set up to be able to achieve the results that they want. So in regards to like key takeaways, when we're talking about stress, we're talking about cortisol and how those can negatively impact us. Granted, cortisol in and of itself is not always a 100% negative thing, but let's go ahead and talk about what are some like top 3 takeaways that you would recommend to our coaches here to employ upon their clients to be able to make sure that they can reduce their stress levels?
Sure. So I think a healthy sleep routine is crucial. I do think that nutrition around the workout can help to manage stress in the form of we're intentionally sort of coupling our stress with movement, like this physical stress. Mm-hmm. And by signaling our body that we are shifting into a recovery or parasympathetic mode, I think that can be really key. So strategically using nutrition, it's a little bit more, there's some anecdotal evidence and then also some studies on it as well. So I think nutrition for like your peri-workout period is going to be very important. Sleep. And then, just overall thinking about the lifestyle, taking an inventory of things that are draining your clients. I've had a few conversations and sometimes folks don't even realize, I've had a client running a business for their mom and running their business and doing things at home for their significant other and all of these other caregiving responsibility related roles. And they don't even realize that they have this cumulative volume of stress on their body. So take inventory of that as a coach and help your clients see that. And even if you're, in your own fitness transformation, just thinking of ways to achieve, balance can be a very woo-woo word at times. But what I mean by that is just achieving a balance between sympathetic stimulus and movement, and strenuous activity, or even brain stress and emotional stress. And then also, those parasympathetic inputs, those recovery inputs and things like that. So that's kind of a huge takeaway as well. So I would say balancing, the nervous system, being strategic with the nutrition, and then really like having a healthy sleep schedule, I think can go a really long way. Oftentimes I see people trying to kind of just like throw supplements at something immediately. I'm a huge fan of adaptogens. I think they work well, but if you don't fix some of the lifestyle problems along with it, it's kind of a Band-Aid solution versus if you take someone who's making the habitual changes and developing really good routines and rituals, and you give them a great supplement or an adaptogen, that really just sort of works together synergistically to ensure that your client is making a lot of progress. So those would probably be my biggest circadian rhythm and cortisol related takeaways.
I think you really wrapped that up beautifully. Those top 3 things, guys, if you could employ those upon your clients and guarantee you that they will most likely be in a much better position to be able to see the results that ideally they want. So I'm very happy that with the number 2 thing you brought up, which was peri-workout nutrition, I'm actually going to be interviewing Chris Barakat as well. And Chris talks very passionately about peri-workout nutrition. So you guys who are listening to this, you guys are going to be in for a treat when I bring him on as well, as that definitely does align with what Sam just said. So moving forward here, we get tons of questions in regards to polycystic ovarian syndrome in the U.S. among our clientele. If you would, if we could go ahead and talk a little bit about what specifically polycystic ovarian syndrome is, and then potential key things that we should essentially look for if we were to work with a client who dealt with PCOS.
Sure. So PCOS specifically, as the name implies with polycystic ovarian syndrome, is when there's generally 3 to 5 symptoms that doctors are looking at when they do diagnose someone with PCOS. And what we're seeing is that sometimes people are classified into this category because it becomes easier from an insurance perspective or a medical treatment perspective to classify these young ladies as having PCOS, when sometimes they may just have some of the symptoms that fall under the umbrella of PCOS. So PCOS, as the name implies, polycystic, would be multiple cysts on the ovaries is one consideration. Oftentimes that's lumped together with insulin dysregulation or poor insulin sensitivity. However, that's not necessarily always the case. Oftentimes you'll see it associated with increased body mass index and increased body fat percentage and overall weight, excess androgens as far as relative to a normal healthy female cycle, with which is partially due to a ratio of luteinizing hormone to follicle stimulating hormone that's a bit out of whack. So we see as much as, or even more than, a 3-to-1 ratio of LH to FSH. And if you're kind of at home studying this, a simple way to break that down is just that those are your hormonal precursors to things like estrogen and progesterone during a healthy 28-day or monthly cycle for females. So the progesterone and estrogen sort of cycle throughout the month, and then ultimately we kind of start anew again, but there's like an LH and FSH peak that are tied into ovulation. So one of the reasons oftentimes that an ovulation occurs or amenorrhea occurs with PCOS is because of issues with LH and FSH, as well as those female hormones specifically. So speaking of that, an additional symptom or reason that oftentimes PCOS is diagnosed or kind of labeled as it is would be amenorrhea, loss of period, or even post-birth control syndrome as well. But there were some recent studies that came out. It was smaller group and wasn't, I don't believe it was here in the United States, but we're seeing more and more that PCOS has a lot to do with inflammation, gut dysbiosis. There is sort of this change in it's a combination of genetics and epigenetics of the insulin receptor. But primarily what the study found was that inflammation or inflammatory markers were a better predictor of PCOS than BMI, body fat percentage, scale weight, waist circumference, all of these things, because typically a lot of folks do sort of stereotype PCOS as overweight women or women with that situation. And then now we're seeing more and more women diagnosed with quote unquote skinny PCOS. And a common treatment for both of these is doctors will often prescribe Metformin, which is a widely studied diabetic drug or pre-diabetes drug to help improve insulin sensitivity and sort of move people away from that diabetic blood glucose range and restore their health. So they do typically prescribe that. And it's also believed that Metformin does sort of adjust or alter the gut microbiome. It's still not like fully understood. There are some doctors that do understand it. I would argue that many doctors do not fully sort of understand the prevalence and bandwidth of like everything that Metformin does in the body. But it's one of the most studied drugs in the world. So safety wise, like that is why it is often like the standard of care or what is prescribed by your physician. But you'll notice there was quite a long list of things that could be wrong where you're ultimately diagnosed with PCOS. Now, what if you're a female competitor who just happened to go through a strenuous contest prep and perhaps you did not have a coach as experienced as Will who knew how to sort of manipulate things and then ultimately reverse diet you? There's a chance that maybe you lost your period throughout your female life. Perhaps there's a chance that you have a few cysts on your ovaries and it's not because you have PCOS. It's just as a female, sometimes you do have cysts in the body, just as males can have cysts, and you can have a cyst in your brain. Really, we can all have cysts in different places. They can be benign and relatively harmless. But let's say that woman had multiple cysts on the ovaries, had lost her period, and she's a bit more muscular or something. They might assume, well, that person has PCOS. Really, you only need, I think, 3 of like the 5 categories to ultimately receive that diagnosis, which is interesting in the sense that there's so many moving pieces and we're still learning so much about gut health, inflammation, and overall training and recovery. So what I try to encourage with folks with PCOS is really just getting a handle on any inflammation if symptoms are present, monitoring gut health with a proper gut health protocol if need be, if they're showing any signs of digestive distress or digestive issues, and then being very mindful of training and exercise selection. If we do have a lot of inflammation going on, we probably want to be on more of a balanced hypertrophy type program or accessory work and body composition type plan with, other light activities like walking and yoga, as opposed to some sort of really intense like CrossFit or intervals or Orange Theory or things like that. We really want to be strategic in how we're applying tension to the body, managing our stress hormones, but also managing our nervous system, managing inflammation, and doing things that are going to allow us to like improve our gut health, which is typically what has worked best in the cases that I've had for women with PCOS. There's also some Eastern medicine or alternative approaches. So there's been a few studies. It was a very small group of women. It was about, I think, a few dozen women. It wasn't like over 100, but 38% of the women who received acupuncture actually, it either alleviated their loss of period, improved their symptoms, or helped with like the discomfort that they were experiencing. So what that shows me or shows us is that acupuncture and alternative things that may be relieving stress or relieving tension or inflammation in the body, it kind of aligns with that study. We don't necessarily have something that says that it's causal or this is causation, but we're starting to see relationships. We're starting to see association. And then anecdotally, we can sort of build from that and draw parallels between these studies. So that's something that I've sort of observed. We know that diet and exercise counseling in the form of personal training or nutrition coaching can directly improve PCOS. So if you have more of a traditional case where someone checks those 5 boxes of, whether that's the androgens, the loss of period, multiple cysts, all of these things, you can significantly improve that just through diet and exercise, and oftentimes, getting really deep into the food log and the food tracking to see, okay, is this someone who's really training very hard and underfeeding themselves and believes that they have PCOS, or is this someone that has PCOS but really just lacks an understanding of tracking macros, lacks an understanding of productive gym sessions and things like that. So always understanding the psychology of your client and getting to know them from a personality perspective. You may have women who are working very, 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 very hard that have lost their period from intense training, as opposed to women who, you have to remember, the body is responding to both of these poles or these extremes of stress. So overeating and underactivity and significant obesity will impact fertility. And then also being very, very lean, being at very high training volumes and very limited caloric intake, that will also impact fertility. So oftentimes in between those two extremes is where we find true like internal health from that standpoint. So really have that honest conversation with your client and try and figure out, okay, what side of the spectrum were they on? Does this person need a reverse diet? Does this person just truly need a caloric deficit? And then work from there and kind of monitor them over time and kind of steer them in the right direction, along with potentially some anti-inflammatory or autoimmune type protocols.
Dude, Sam, that was super, super insightful, man. Thank you so much for going so in depth about all of that. So I did take some notes, and I want to review a couple of these things, specifically around that being able to control PCOS, because really what I think we're looking like, that amount of information is so amazing that I don't think all of our listeners may have grabbed a hold to every little piece of that. So what I want to do is kind of work my way back through it and then see your takeaways in regards to what we may be able to implement to be able to help out those clients who are struggling with PCOS. So the first thing I know that you had mentioned was utilizing metformin as a supplement or a drug to be able to regulate insulin sensitivity. Now, you're obviously aware of the berberine studies, right?
Correct. So as for someone who is not on metformin, you could substitute berberine or use Eastern medicine or herbals. I'm very pro herbals. I was just speaking more towards if you are in the place of a lifestyle nutrition coach or personal trainer, obviously we cannot prescribe pharmaceutical intervention, whereas the physician will. So it's more so letting these coaches know, okay, this is the most common approach. So as a coach, you could potentially look to improve blood glucose using something like berberine or a glucose disposal agent. However, oftentimes you'll find that many of these women have already been to their OBGYN or their primary care physician or some form of fertility doctor that may have taken steps to prescribe certain medications prior to you encountering them. So when you're doing your client intake, when you're doing your questionnaire and you're learning more about this client, just make sure you're fully aware of any prescriptions that they may be on is really all I was kind of going for with that. But berberine can certainly work in the sense of improving carbohydrate tolerance and overall health from that standpoint, for sure.
Now, as a means to improve insulin sensitivity, could we kind of take this down to being something simple as far as like regulating the amount of carbohydrate that a specific client with PCOS may be taking in that kind of help out with some of that inflammation, to help out with some of that insulin resistance that they may be already currently facing?
I think it really depends on their current diet, right? And we've known, and this is something that Lane, like one of your colleagues, speaks about a lot, but even just a calorie deficit in itself will improve insulin sensitivity. Right. So that is where, okay, let's say we have an insulin issue, but it's in a very, very lean competitor. Do they really have intolerance to carbohydrates, or are they highly stressed, have high cortisol levels, are training a lot and have other forms of inflammation in the body and gut issues, which will then signal the body to release these inflammatory messengers or cytokines, which then releases more corticosteroids or cortisol as a result. And then ultimately we end up with this cycle, and then potentially we're breaking down more energy, creating blood sugar in the bloodstream. So I would say it highly, highly depends. Let's say you have an overweight client who's overeating carbohydrates. Yes, I would highly recommend getting those carbohydrates under control in an amount that is conducive to their activity level and their body type. But I think that is one wide sweeping recommendation, is you see a lot of these women on PCOS where it's like they're going keto or they're going low carb. Well, you may not need to go to that extreme to ultimately improve your symptoms, improve your health, and just feel better. So I try to sort of live in the middle, which is very case by case dependent, depending on lifestyle factors, their exercise of choice, what they enjoy doing, the foods they enjoy, and where they're going to be most compliant to ultimately staying within their calorie and macronutrient allotment.
And you feel like PCOS is something that females could essentially avoid if they were to preserve like a positive energy homeostasis for the majority of their life, instead of constantly trying to focus on overstressing the system with being in a chronic caloric deficit for 10, 20 years in a row, utilizing a lot of exercise to be able to try to get the body that they desire. Do you feel like PCOS is something that could essentially be avoided if we were taught more about education and how to kind of balance stress and homeostasis equally over time?
I definitely think that there are some cases that could be avoided. And then I definitely think there are some cases, there still seems to be, and I say seems because PCOS is really an enigma. So we learn more and more about it every single year. Right. There seems to be a slight genetic variation on our insulin receptor gene, which means that some women are predisposed to it. However, I would argue that in the form of epigenetics and the decisions we make every day and the exercise and nutritional choices that we make, that even many cases when our genes are maybe programmed to respond a certain way, that we can positively influence that with great nutrition, great lifestyle, stress management, understanding the nervous system and things like that. So I always think education is a great solution to helping us stay ahead of these issues. But I think it would also be naive of me to say that we could totally prevent every single case. There are obviously extremes there. However, I think it would certainly help with the management of symptoms. It may delay certain onsets. It may help preserve fertility or like a normal healthy cycle. So I do agree with Will in the sense that I think education plays a huge component. I certainly agree that many of these cases, especially ones that are more just centered on amenorrhea or quote unquote skinny PCOS, as opposed to kind of what we used to view PCOS as like 10, 20 years ago with overweight women, I would say that, nutrition and training are certainly going to be at the crux of that in terms of what we can manipulate within the lifestyle.
Yeah. Dude, I love that. I love how everything is so context dependent. There's nothing that's essentially black and white. We understand everything that works kind of within that gray space. And then bringing up that conversation of epigenetics. So essentially us inheriting, what our parents did, what their parents did, and so on and so forth. All that is super, super fascinating. So let's go ahead and bring this back around kind of full circle. And if we could provide maybe 3 important key takeaways for females who may be dealing with PCOS, what would you recommend from a nutritional perspective or a training perspective to be able to help kind of regulate blood sugar and training intensity?
Sure. So my three main takeaways, the first takeaway would just be understanding what PCOS is. PCOS is an enigma. We know that it impacts fertility, a healthy menstrual cycle, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and sometimes androgens as well as insulin sensitivity. That's kind of where PCOS falls. Your doctor may diagnose you for any one of or three out of those like 5 reasons. So understanding there's variability there, I think that'd be point number 1. 2, modulating training intensity in the form of, probably following an intelligently periodized resistance training program, and then using things like walking, yoga, and active recovery for movement, as opposed to, I would not recommend like being a long distance runner per se, or doing a lot of extended impact laden cardio in that we're learning more about inflammation in the body. The third, I think nutrition related, would be obviously starting with a food log, whether you are a coach or in your own fitness journey. Coaches, I think your greatest resource is truly to see a 5 to 7 day food log from your client, have a really honest conversation with them around, okay, you're at this weight, you believe that you have PCOS, and these are your symptoms. Like, is this the norm for you? How do you modulate stress, and where is this? I try to dig in, because if you think about it, a loss of period is basically the body saying, I do not want to get pregnant at this time, whether it's for stress reasons, safety reasons, other health issues. If we look at adaptive physiology and safety theory, we just kind of zoom out and we have the perspective of, well, why would the body have irregular or dysfunction when it comes to hormones, right? So understanding that the loss of fertility is just like, hey, we're not prepared to have a baby right now, we can start to look and take a stress inventory. So I'd say my third point is going to be inventory of nutrition, inventory of stress. If inflammation seems to be present based off of digestion, achy joints, discomfort, overall, other health symptoms that might be going on in the body, we may want to do some sort of modified elimination diet or modified autoimmune paleo type situation where we're eliminating certain foods and irritants to help improve gut health and improve overall digestion, which then ultimately is going to help with the assimilation of nutrients and energy, and then help with the exercise and overall thing that we're going for. Not every woman I've ever worked with in PCOS required a calorie deficit. Some do, and some do not. So I would say the third point with nutrition is take that inventory, really have an honest conversation with the client, get to know them before making any significant decisions. And then once you do know them and understanding if they do need the calorie deficit, our nutritional protocol is going to be decided based on their physiology and their physiological symptoms. So that's going to be digestion based, that's going to be energy based, and just overall feelings. You're going to take inventory of that biofeedback, and then that'll allow you to make choices in terms of food type or diet type, or things like that. So some women may just need calorie control and follow somewhat of a macronutrient based, somewhat flexible diet, whereas other women may have to kind of bring in the reins. It's not uncommon to see PCOS and Hashimotos together, in which case we might be still following calories and macros, but substituting things like grains or irritants or dairy and stuff with, more paleo based foods, not because paleo is like a magic fat loss solution, but because we're trying to just limit the inflammatory response in the body.
Absolutely. I loved how you intertwine that into Hashimoto's and like those big key major takeaways. I just want to highlight something really quick, because anecdotally, I do not consider myself like a hormone expert by any means. However, anecdotally, the things that I've done specifically align with kind of like what Sam just said. So it's regulating training intensity, regulating training volume, and understanding that on both sides of the coin, it's not going to be good, whether you're an endurance athlete or whether you're somebody who wants to lift weights 7 days a week. The other thing is recommending a GDA or a glucose disposal agent to kind of help with that insulin sensitivity. And then also, even though we do recommend, utilizing tracking macronutrients as a system to be able to really provide our clients the tools they need to gain lifelong control over their metabolisms, we also have to go a bit deeper than that and understand that it's sometimes not all about the macros and not all about flexible dieting, but actually addressing each and every client as an individual case and finding out what foods specifically possibly make them feel inflamed, and kind of over the course of time, figuring out what foods make them feel and perform the best.
Right. 100%.
Awesome. So so I know that you had brought up Hashimoto's. So how does kind of that transition into Hashimoto's?
So how that's all going to transition into Hashimoto's is, so they're really sort of separate and unique situations. So with PCOS, we mentioned LH and FSH in terms of our hormones, what was going on with androgens. Hashimoto's is called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So it is a condition that pertains to the thyroid, which is a different gland and organ in the body as opposed to our reproductive system, though they are very closely integrated and really do sort of have feedback with each other, or communication with each other. So Hashimoto's thyroiditis is essentially where we begin to develop thyroid antibodies that attack the thyroid, or sort of trigger a autoimmune response, which normally in a healthy individual, we trigger an autoimmune response to like a foreign invader or substance that we need to attack in the body. But what begins to happen with Hashimoto's thyroiditis is our body triggers an autoimmune response sort of on ourselves, essentially. And what we see is, due to stress and a number of other things, this begins to impact thyroid health. We see reverse T3 elevated as opposed to free T3, which is our metabolically active hormone. So we see downregulations of metabolism, oftentimes inflammation, autoimmunity, sometimes gut health issues as well. And so Hashimoto's is also sort of an enigma, but it comes under that premise of safety theory and adaptive physiology, that basically our body is sort of adapting or creating these changes in the thyroid, and we become less sensitive to things like thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary. And regardless of our body's stress response, and regardless of our body's pituitary response, that particular function of the thyroid is then inhibited or limited. And that's where we begin to see issues with weight and things like that. So we still need to control calories. We likely still need to do resistance training, things like that, walking and daily movement. However, we really want to control stress. We really want to monitor gut health. We really do need an autoimmune protocol, or potentially an elimination diet, because the body basically is already perceiving that we have a lot of these invaders per se going on, when really we need it to understand that it's doing it to itself. And so you're looking at things like TPO antibodies in the body, and we're looking at things in the blood work like T3, T4, TSH, as well as reverse T3. So the thyroid produces T4, but then in the liver and the gut, we convert T4 to metabolically active T3. And what happens is, oftentimes we lose that free metabolically active T3 to reverse T3. Also, when we're highly stressed, sometimes we can see elevations in TSH, which is that precursor, kind of just like when we talked about luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone. That pituitary sort of stimulates the thyroid with thyroid stimulating hormone, which is released from the pituitary. So in women, and actually it is possible for men to have Hashimoto's, it's just far more common in women. We do frequently need to use an elimination diet or autoimmune approach. However, we still need to sort of do a total daily energy expenditure estimate. We need to figure out their calories and where they are in terms of their macronutrients, and control their stress overall. So those would be my biggest takeaways from Hashimoto's. And Will, I'm sure you have some thoughts as well from your client base.
Yeah, so I actually have some questions for you, just because so much of this revolves around the pituitary gland signaling to the thyroid, suppression. Do you feel like there's currently any ways or any anecdotes currently, or like observations that you've seen that could essentially help kind of optimize your thyroid's ability? So obviously we know that leptin is connected. Leptin will send a signal to pituitary gland, pituitary to your thyroid, kind of re-stimulating, reactivating if we are in this like optimized caloric state. Do you feel like there's a connection there to where if we're essentially eating more calories, or making sure that these calories aren't causing inflammation, making sure that we're doing some kind of process of elimination diet to make sure that the nutrients we're putting into our bodies are actually in alignment with our body? Do you think that an elevation in calorie could positively impact that?
I think for anyone that's been chronically dieting or is under high stress, I think we still need to take into account that balance. I would say that oftentimes we may see an elimination diet and autoimmune approach in conjunction with a reverse diet, not necessarily in replace of,
Right.
but oftentimes one of the reasons the body is having that stress, you'll see Hashimoto's in the cases of, say, a CrossFitter who is training strenuously and under eating. They're training for performance, but they're not eating for performance.
Right.
And when we lack that nutritional periodization, we have high stress on the body, we ultimately do need a reverse diet. And in conjunction with that reverse diet, we are doing other things as well. So, it's one I view as food quality and food decision-making versus food quantity. The food quantity may go up even as we improve food quality, or for someone that maybe has not been in a calorie deficit, maybe the food quantity is going down, but the quality is improving to get more micronutrients and have less inflammation overall.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That'd be super interesting to dig a little bit more into because, personally, I've never really worked with that many CrossFit athletes to the point to where they're really overloading with astronomical amounts of volume to the point where that it's actually negatively impacting their overall health. Usually the individuals that I've worked with or that some of the coaches in the Fitness Online Coaching Academy have worked with are predominantly physique athletes, or maybe we have them training, 4 to 5 days a week, and we're actually regulating training volume to make sure that there's still adequate ability to be able to recover. And then obviously utilizing things like, 72-hour refeeds all the way up to extended diet breaks to be able to kind of offset any of those negative physiological adaptations that actually happen to the thyroid over the course of time when you're following a low calorie diet. So that'll definitely be something that I'm interested to look a little bit more into so that both myself and obviously the coaches in the Fitness Online Coaching Academy can actually look a little bit more into and really understand if we have a client that's either suffering from PCOS or Hashimoto's. I believe now we have at least a framework of how we would essentially be able to help them. And it's all thanks to you, man. So I really, really appreciate you.
I would say Hashimoto's can definitely happen with bikini competitors too. I didn't mean to necessarily label a particular sport as the only reason. Mm-hmm. It's a common reason, but also you could achieve the same thing with excess cardio and excess resistance training, because we have to remember we're also signaling the central nervous system in addition to what we're doing hormonally, in addition to what we're doing from a calorie standpoint. Oftentimes, if it's happening in individuals as a result of overtraining and other things, it's overtraining combined with undereating and stress and lack of sleep. Our body is fairly resilient. However, when we really, really push it into a corner, it's ultimately going to protect ourselves and fight back in a way. And that's really, these adaptive conditions are a result of the adaptive stress response, because our body's basically to the point where it's beginning to run out of resources to handle what we're throwing at it. And it will cope with it for a very long time. It doesn't necessarily mean it's happy, but it will try to sort of cope and compromise. So that's sort of my biggest takeaway for Hashimoto's.
Yeah, I mean, we do absolutely see it within the space of, like, let's say, for instance, I'm sure you've heard this before, 700 to 900 calories a day, 2 to 3 hours of cardio a day, and the individual's doing 5 sets of 15 on every single exercise, and they're just working out for 3-4 hours every single day, and they're barely even eating. So I've actually seen this case happen plenty of times, and I've worked with hundreds of bikini girls who come to me that are in that stress position. And honestly, the best thing that so many of them can do is just get themselves out of that hell. So dude, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me this afternoon. I really, really appreciate it. And some of these insights that you brought, I know are going to be invaluable to the coaches here in the Fitness Online Coaching Academy and whoever else watches this, wherever the content ends up being. So Sam, man, if you could just let the people know where they can get a hold of you, what kind of services you offer, anything about you that you would like your audience to know.
Sure. So, as we discussed earlier, so I'm on Instagram as Sam Miller Science. Soon that should have a site of its own. Until then, kind of hang on. We should be developing like a sammillerscience.com of sorts. But right now, my primary company is Oracle Training and Nutrition. You can find us at oraclefitness.com. We do offer training and nutrition for clients. My primary focus, however, is the hormonal blueprint ebook, which will be coming out for pre-release April 24th of 2019, and then fully on sale with some additional resources on April 29th. If you're looking to learn more about hormones, that ebook is a great resource. And then I also run the Oracle Applied Science Methods Mentorship for Coaches, which is a 12-week program designed to teach you all of the different facets of advanced nutrition, nutritional endocrinology, neurotransmitters, balancing the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, and more advanced metabolism concepts that really are hard to distill from a lot of resources on the internet. So that's one of my largest focuses right now. And if you have any questions, I do frequently, along with Will, not only like stories and live videos and things like that, but I'm always open to answer questions, whether that's DM or potentially if you have a proposed topic that you'd like to see. I know Will and I collaborate quite frequently, so we're more than happy to potentially do a live video or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. And guys, I will be providing all of that information about Sam Miller down below in the comment section or in the description of this video. Everybody, I just want to take a moment to say thank you all so much for making it through this video, listening to everything Sam Miller had to tell you guys about hormones, about PCOS, Hashimotos, and all of the different considerations when it comes to you guys working with your clients who may be suffering from these types of issues. Thank you all so much for checking out this video. I appreciate you, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks, Will.
Oh.